Markdown is everywhere. If you're a developer, you probably use it every day. READMEs on GitHub, documentation, personal notes, comments, company wikis. It has become the de facto standard for writing anything in the tech world. But today I want to ask an uncomfortable question. What if Markdown is actually a problem? What if we're using the wrong tool for the wrong reasons, damaging not only our productivity but the entire open source ecosystem? This video is based on an open letter to the open source community that will spark quite a debate. And I warn you, some things you'll hear might make you uncomfortable, especially if you're a fan of Obsidian or if you think plain text is the way. But I ask you to listen until the end because the problem is much deeper than it seems. Let's start with the basics. Markdown is a lightweight markup syntax created in 2004. Yes, you heard that right, 2004. It's not an ancient standard, it's relatively recent. Before Markdown, developers mainly used HTML for documentation, as you can still see in tools like JavaDoc. The idea behind Markdown was simple, to create a format that was easy to read and write in plain text. Sounds reasonable, right? The problem is that this sentence hides two fundamental flaws that are at the root of all Markdown problems. First flaw, easy to read and write in plain text is a feature, not a purpose. It doesn't answer the question, why should it exist, but only, what does it do? When you design something without asking yourself what problem to solve, you end up creating a tool that simply does things instead of solving real problems. Second flaw, when we say something must be easy to read in plain text, we're saying that the raw text and the rendered output must look similar. If the final document shows a table, the plain text should also look like a table, built with hand-drawn ASCII characters. But guess what? Plain text isn't made for drawing. These 2 points are the root of every frustration related to Markdown. From a design perspective, trying to satisfy both humans and machines with the same syntax simply makes no sense. It's like trying to create a new type of QR code that's both readable and writable by machines and humans by hand. It's a dumb requirement, and from a dumb requirement you can already predict the result, an extremely limited and frustrating format. So what can Markdown do? Titles, subtitles, bold, italic, bullet lists, links, images, and tables. Sounds complete, right? Let's look closer. Markdown tables are a disaster. You have to manually align all the characters. If you modify one cell, you have to realign all the lines. You can't have multiple cells, row span, col span, colors. These are basic text features, and you can't use them. In reality, almost nobody writes Markdown tables by hand. They use helpers and extensions like the Markdown WYSIWYG table generator. What an irony. We wanted to do everything in text without interfaces, and we end up using WYSIWYG interfaces because otherwise it's unusable. But beyond tables, Markdown lacks tons of basic features. No underline, no font size or color changes, no way to position elements or add simple diagrams. And when it comes to more advanced things, it's simply impossible. Sure, there are some cases where Markdown works decently, for example, in code comments. Although honestly, having clickable diagrams directly in the code would be incredible, but usually documentation lives elsewhere anyway. Since Markdown is so limited, platforms extend it with other syntaxes. HTML for missing features, Mermaid or Plant UML for diagrams. Let's talk about Mermaid. Mermaid is a JavaScript library for rendering schematic diagrams. It uses another custom text-based syntax that then gets rendered visually. Most Markdown renderers now support it natively. But is it really a good tool? We've already seen that building rich text on top of a manually editable plain text syntax wasn't a great idea. And for 2D diagrams, drawing with characters was already awkward for formatted text, let alone for diagrams. Fortunately, Mermaid doesn't even try to make the raw text look like the final diagram. So the only requirement left is plain text editable by hand. But here it becomes even harder to justify. If you're no longer aiming for visual similarity and the syntax is just a machine-readable data format, why are we still writing it by hand? It becomes more like JSON than Markdown. Why not just use a proper graphical editor like Draw.io, Inkscape, or even PowerPoint? Not surprisingly, Most people who use Mermaid regularly don't actually write it by hand. They use web-based tools like Mermaid Live that provide, you guessed it, a WYSIWYG interface. Once again, the same irony. We start by rejecting graphical interfaces to stay in plain text, and we end up using graphical interfaces because the syntax is too painful to edit. Even with these relaxed constraints, Mermaid's design leads to big usability issues. Since users aren't expected to manually define coordinates, Mermaid replaces freeform drawing with a series of diagram types, each with its own custom syntax. This means you must learn a specific syntax for each diagram type. If you want to edit a complex diagram, you have to relearn that syntax. And if the kind of diagram you need doesn't exist, or you want to combine two types, it's simply not possible. Meanwhile, with any proper WYSIWYG tool, you just drag and drop shapes and connect lines. No syntax memorization, less frustration, virtually no limits. Mermaid can be powerful for automatically generated diagrams from code, but for handwritten diagrams, no, it's not useful. Draw.io is better, PowerPoint is better, SVG plus Inkscape are better. Almost anything is better for human editing. Markdown dominates today, but it's not alone. There are alternative formats that aim for roughly the same goals: ASCII doc, restructured text, textile. You might not have even heard of them. As you might expect, all these syntaxes oscillate between two extremes. On one side, data-like formats such as HTML. On the other, ASCII art-like syntaxes inspired by Markdown. Some are slightly better than others, but overall, the picture isn't great. So why is Markdown everywhere? Especially when we already have far more versatile standards like SVG or HTML. The right question to ask is, as a developer, why do I see Markdown everywhere? Because outside the world of development, Markdown is almost completely unknown, and not without reason. When you develop software, your main output is code, and every mainstream programming language only understands plain text files, so your main tool is naturally a text editor. It could have been different, as in Temple OS's DullDoc, where the compiler actually knew where to get the code inside a complex format. But no, all common languages only handle plain text, and that's fine. When your main medium is plain text, it's no surprise that developers wanted a way to explain and highlight certain parts of the code with comments. Wanting to standardize this isn't necessarily a bad idea. But this idea falls apart when you try to write entire documents in this format. Because when it comes to documentation, manually editing plain text is no longer a real constraint, especially since documentation is often completely separate from the code itself. Developers also face another constraint: version control systems like Git. I won't go into detail, but Git doesn't like non-text files, for good reasons. Okay, maybe you do want a text format for your documents, but that doesn't mean you need to edit those files manually. Take Microsoft Word, for example. A Word document is just a compressed XML file. If we could use it directly without compression, with some adaptation, it could theoretically be versioned via Git. Probably not ideal, but it shows the huge gap between pure text and a proper editor. And really, how many companies or individuals do you know who don't rely heavily on Office tools? Also, creating documentation or diagrams is often many times faster and more enjoyable with an Office suite. When someone creates a diagram in PowerPoint, it's simple and easy for anyone to maintain. But when a developer rewrites everything as text, they're just wasting time and making future changes slower. So, in short, they're completely wrong to do that, especially since merges on these kinds of documents are extremely rare and easy to handle manually. Did you recognize yourself? Do you feel a little uncomfortable reading this? We'll talk about that shortly. Now let's talk about note-taking systems based on Markdown, like Obsidian. Among the reasons often cited in favor of Obsidian, some are indeed very good, but many of the most commonly mentioned reasons simply aren't convincing. One of the most common arguments is that they provide a trusted, future-proof text format. The idea is simple. Since our notes are in plain text, we should always be able to read and edit them, even if the Markdown application we use disappears. But here's the catch. Markdown is never standard. Take just one example, callouts in Obsidian. Obsidian has a special feature called callouts that lets you highlight text in a visually distinct way. It's a nice feature, but it is not part of the official Markdown standard. So much for future proof, especially when you consider that Obsidian itself is not open source. And things get even worse when you start looking at Obsidian's extensions. In Obsidian, you can extend the functionality with extensions, and there are tons of them available. Some help you write tables, others add custom features like executable code areas or integrate external tools like draw.io. Some extensions add custom syntaxes directly into the document. Others try to stick to the Markdown standard, but don't always integrate it fully. It's important to remember that these extensions are maintained by third parties, and they may stop being supported at any time. This particularly undermines the sustainability of the ecosystem, especially since some extensions aren't compatible with all devices, or may even change the Markdown syntax itself. So no, definitely not future-proof. Another common argument is, I keep my data locally on my devices, without relying on the cloud. But once again, this is not without problems. SD cards and hard drives are fragile. They can be lost or damaged. If you place so much importance on your notes that you sometimes call them your second brain, synchronization becomes essential. Let's get straight to the point. In Obsidian, official synchronization requires a monthly payment and is centralized. So if you take this seriously, it's not free, and it's indeed a form of lock-in to a proprietary system. Of course, these are just files, so could we use an external tool? Short answer, no, you can't. On Android, Obsidian still does not support cloud apps like Google Drive. They have no interest in developing it, especially because managing native Android functions like the content provider in Electron is not trivial. As for other external synchronization tools like SyncThing, the combination with Android's disk access restrictions means that SyncThing and Obsidian cannot read and write to the same folders. It might be technically feasible by adding an extra layer, but at this stage, is it worth it? Probably not. Not to mention that this kind of setup is not only painful to configure, but also extremely user-unfriendly. When your notes are important enough to be your second brain, synchronization becomes essential, and Obsidian makes it unnecessarily complicated. Let's put this into perspective. Is it really so critical to avoid proprietary lock-in at all costs? First, it's important to remember that no data format has ever been permanent. Formats evolve, whether for images, music, office documents, or others. Some eventually become obsolete and are replaced. Even if we consider plain text as a base format, it doesn't change the reality. Markdown itself only dates back to 2004. Seeking a more durable and open format can certainly extend the lifespan of your data, but as we've seen, this is not really true for Obsidian. So what? Do we give up everything? No, of course not. There's one key question to ask. If the services linked to my note-taking system shut down tomorrow, would I still be able to open my notes and transfer them to another system? If the answer is no, it's probably best to avoid that system entirely. Fortunately, this is not the case for Obsidian, but it's also true for MS Word, Cherry Tree, or any other offline file editor. In this respect, there's nothing inherently special about Markdown, except that it is particularly unergonomic and not user-friendly. Assessing whether a system is user-friendly is always complex. There's a good reason why, in UX processes, prototypes are normally tested with real users. However, there are still two obvious issues if we remember that we are developers. First, special characters. As developers, we quickly learn to type a wide range of special characters. We instinctively know where to find symbols like hashes, curly braces, or square brackets on a keyboard. For a new user, however, there's an additional challenge. They must also learn how to type these characters. And you can bet that many will give up as soon as they encounter Markdown's limitations. The problem becomes even worse on smartphones and touch keyboards, where typing these characters is even less intuitive and ergonomic. Finally, another critical issue for user-friendliness. Markdown is never WYSIWYG. I've heard people claim that Obsidian is WYSIWYG, but that's not true. There seems to be some confusion about what WYSIWYG actually means. WYSIWYG stands for What You See is What You Get, and refers to software that allows content to be edited visually in a form that closely matches the final displayed output. Despite the claims of some applications, when using Markdown, you almost always edit the source code, not the rendered text. Editing source code for a document is particularly confusing and unusual for average users. As we've seen, not only is this unnecessary, but it's also strange to mix back-end and front-end in software, especially when there's no need to directly access the storage format. To conclude, despite the hype around Obsidian and the popularity of Markdown, it is far from user-friendly. So, if you want to create a documentation and note-taking app that is easy to use, lightweight for any device, accessible with minimal knowledge, and available to the widest range of people, you should not use Markdown at all. If you're even slightly curious about note-taking apps, you've probably noticed the insane amount of Markdown-based apps that have been created. Obsidian, Joplin, Logseek, Standard Notes, Zedler, Simple Markdown, Tangent Note, Noteless, Dendron, Cuyuan, Foam, QBText, Cone Notes, Silverbullet, NoteUp, OtterWiki, Reor, Rucola, and probably many others I'm not aware of. How can we explain such relentlessness, such an enormous amount of work put into developing yet another Markdown app that will supposedly do things the right way? Has anyone ever asked whether Markdown itself is really a good base? And above all, what a waste of time and effort. In the book, How Big Things Get Done by Bent Flyvbjerg and Dan Gardner, the authors discuss the notion of opportunity cost. Imagine what could have been accomplished if all this effort on more impactful or useful projects. When considering note-taking apps, we have two categories: big, easy-to-use commercial applications that can be understood simply by exploring the interface, and apps based on Markdown, which require the average user to learn Markdown syntax, type unusual characters, learn HTML, and other formats. All this effort ends in limitations and frustration everywhere. Do you really think the average user can or will use a Markdown-based note app? The answer is simple: no, they won't. You've made it this far. Well done. Sincerely, it's a great sign that you want to face issues head-on and improve. But why is questioning Markdown so controversial, generating so much engagement when it clearly shouldn't? Why is it a subject so sensitive that it may even make some people uncomfortable about their past choices? The answer lies in human psychology and culture. Tools are tools, and it should be perfectly healthy to discuss and critique them freely. However, it seems that Markdown has become an untouchable value. But what value are we really talking about? The value of Markdown itself? No value in general. What if Markdown has become a dogma? Don't get me wrong, Markdown is excellent for many people, and many can't do without it. It has its purpose and usefulness. What I'm saying is not that Markdown is useless, but that its widespread adoption and the way it's perceived have transformed it for many into something that goes beyond a technical tool. When you don't use Markdown, people don't just judge your tools, they judge you based on the tools you use. In extreme cases, people will even discredit statements based on the tools used. Look, they're still using word the losers. Lumeau, he said my tools seemed complicated, ignorant. In reality, this is a form of elitism and dogmatism, a subtle kind of discrimination that often goes unnoticed. One problem with this dogmatism is that the community tends to close in on itself. When an average user asks a friend who is highly knowledgeable about computers for advice on note-taking, the answer is often simply Markdown. Not only is this answer inappropriate for most users, but it also contributes to further marginalizing developers, and, by extension, the broader open-source universe. Before wrapping up this discussion, it's essential to talk about solutions. Beyond Markdown, a huge problem is the lack of a flexible and open standard. Despite their success, open-source standards are rarely decided collectively. In practice, they're imposed by individuals or by the inertia of popular platforms. Unfortunately, Markdown is now everywhere. It's hard-coded into GitLab, GitHub, and countless other tools. If we wanted to experiment with richer formats using iframes, embedded scripts, or new syntaxes, these are blocked by XSS security rules. That's a huge obstacle for experimentation and tool development. And in environments where every line of code is reviewed, this security argument feels very weak. We could imagine smarter rules, for example, allowing scripts and links when they come from the repository itself. Solutions exist, but right now, the ecosystem is not healthy enough to allow innovation easily. To build better things, we'll need to define standards designed in a way that's compatible with the open source workflow, reasonably asynchronous, democratic, open to experimentation, expandable. The day we figure out how to do this, the Linux ecosystem and the free software world will be unstoppable. Until then, if you want to build a great note-taking app, experiment with formats. If you like Markdown, fine, use it. But don't impose its restrictions on others, and don't promote a system that won't suit the majority of users. Don't let Markdown define you. Stay open-minded. Don't be dogmatic about tools. Stop promoting Markdown and plain text formats as the solution. They are tools, not the tool. For the vast majority of people, they are not a good tool. Push back where it makes sense. Use better formats when Markdown limits you. Stop purism and elitism. Don't discriminate against people who avoid text-only tools. Maybe they're right. Support experimentation. Encourage those who try new ways of documenting. Hack the platforms, GitHub, GitLab, VS Code. Stop blocking innovation with unnecessary restrictions like iframes and scripts. Consider user needs rather than a form of ideological purity. Stop creating new Markdown applications thinking that this will be the right way to proceed, because it won't be. Instead, define what the goals are and what problems it will solve. And above all, there's no right or wrong way to code, only solutions that work better than others. Rules exist, but sometimes the smartest thing you can do is break them. Take the standards and best practices as a guide for creating your own rules, not as absolute dogma. Ask yourself, does my method and my tools serve the goal, or am I serving the method? The goal is not to kill Markdown, but to make space for better tools and better thinking. And please, make this space more welcoming and friendly for you and for everyone else. To be gentle, to be kind. This is the way.